So last weekend, I was leaving and I was walking through the lobby, and as I was walking through the lobby, somebody stopped me and they said, "Hey, you're preaching next weekend, right?" And I thought to myself, did I miss an announcement that, I'm the next guy up, And so I was a little curious. I said, "Yes, but how did you know that?" And the guy looked at me straight in the eye without hesitation and said, "Because I read chapter 10 and I saw all the names in chapter 10, and I figured Lee must be preaching that message." Y'all, have you been reading? Have you seen chapter 10? Like, it's nothing but names. And if you turn the page, chapter 11 is not much better, and chapter 12 is not much better. And Brian, in his goodness to me, said, "You do that. Here, you mess up all those names, because I will mess up every single one of them." All kidding aside, I am really excited about being able to share with you something really profound that's in the middle of all these names. To share with you something that is near and dear to my heart. Now, in order to help make it make sense, I need to tell you just a wee bit about me again. I try to do that every time I teach. And in doing that, what I want to tell you is this, that in general, I am a fairly neat and organized kind of guy. I mean, I am. I like my world in order, both literally and metaphorically. I'm that kind of a guy. Now, the truth is, if you walk into my office, it's very likely that you're going to find piles of papers and stacks of books and things in all kinds of different places, because I am easily distracted. I'm always too busy. I've always got the next project in my mind, and so I'm rushing. I don't do a good job assessing time, and so I'm always a little bit late because the project took a little bit longer. And so what happens is I just drop things on whatever flat surface I can find. By now, you're probably going, "You're not neat and organized at all, Lee." Fair enough. But let me take it a step further. So a few weeks ago, someone was talking to me. If you've ever joined us online, there's a little secret. We actually go live about 10 minutes before service time. And we do about a 10-minute video, a pastoral moment where I get to sit in front of our online campus and share with them various things that are going on and things that are happening in my heart. And somebody was talking to me about that the other day, and they were saying, "I love that you do that from your desk because it's so neat and orderly and clean." And I thought to myself, bless your heart. You know what that means, right? I'm not going to define it. Because what you don't know is underneath the desk are all the piles of things around my feet, and the stuff gets shoved in the drawers before I turn on the camera. I stick things behind books on bookshelves so you can't see it, so it looks all neat and orderly. Now, the truth is that happens, and life gets busy, and the piles, get bigger, and they get more and more frustrating. And then I hit a moment where I am incredibly uncomfortable with what's going on around me, and I need to clear my life up. I need to reorder. And what happens then is it looks like my office throws up. Like everything comes out of the drawers, everything comes out of the boxes, and there is a massive reordering that takes place. I need to do that for a minute right here so that I can see what I'm talking about here for a second. But today, as we turn the corner in Nehemiah, we know that that's what's been going on in this book. The story begins with Nehemiah looking around at Jerusalem, his hometown, and going, "This is a mess," right? He sees the walls are broken down, life and vitality have left the city of Jerusalem. In fact, it's been vacated because crime has risen and the quality of life has declined. And so Jerusalem is a mess. And Nehemiah has taken the people and said, "Let me show you the disorder," and said, "It's time for a reordering." And we have listened and talked about and thought about and read about the reordering that has occurred in miraculous time as the people have banded together for something greater. And as we've seen that, we might have not realized that sometimes the headline is not really the headline. Because the headline of the book of Nehemiah is "The People Rebuild the Walls." I can't tell you how many books I've seen and read about the rebuilding of the walls of Nehemiah, because that's the headline, except it's not the headline. The headline is actually this: God reorders his people. You see, God was doing something in the hearts and lives of the people that was far more profound than rebuilt walls and revitalized cities. And while that's an important story and it's a great consequence, the headline is the reordering that God does in his people. And in telling us that story and giving us this moment, this glimpse of how God would work in his people, God is telling us something about his heart for us, that he wants all of us to experience what the people in Nehemiah's day experienced in the moments that we're going to look at between the names in these chapters. That God, in a sentence, that God has called us as his children to something greater, and that something greater is a reordered life. It's a reordered life. Now, in order to be faithful and not bury the headline myself today, I want to be sure that you hear what I'm saying. You see, what God is calling us to through this story in Nehemiah is something that we like to call the sanctified life. A reordered life is a sanctified life. Now, sanctified is a word that gets said a lot in church circles such as ours, and people smile and they nod. They even use the word in a sentence. You know, sometimes when people use a word in a sentence, it doesn't mean that they know what it means, right? You know, I don't know if you've ever done that, you know, tell me, show me, prove to me you know what that word means, and you go, well, that word is, and you use the word, and then you're like, but that didn't tell me you know what it means, right? And sometimes sanctification's like that. Like, we know what justification is, right? Because we've got a pithy little statement for that, just as if I've never sinned. So when we use justification, we know that we're talking about how God clears a record. But when we talk about sanctification, that feels more abstract, more distant, and we just kind of sometimes, if we're not careful, smile and nod. And so what I want to do this morning is I want to maybe take a few moments, if I can, and try to explain this reordered or this sanctified life through the lens of what God is doing through his people. I know that over the next few weeks, you're very aware of this. You're in the middle of it, just like I am. We're going to celebrate God entering our world. And God enters our world, and we use a lot of words around that. Today, we focused on a moment in Advent that is peace. But probably greater than peace and probably greater than any other word we're going to use is the word joy, right? I mean, people put those three letters out in their lawns, and we put them on Christmas cards. We even sing it. In fact, sing this with me. Joy to the world. You're supposed to sing, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room. And heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. And heaven and nature sing. We sing about joy to the world. And where does that joy come from? Well, it comes because God kept his promises and he sent his Messiah through Jesus. But he also comes because that Messiah reordered our broken world. That joy comes from the reordered life, the sanctified life that God offers us. And we're going to celebrate that appropriately. But God, in his gift of Christmas and in these moments that we will celebrate, God is inviting us to experience what the people that we find here in Nehemiah 10, 11, and 12 experience in these particular moments, a reordering of their lives. So here's where we find ourselves. Jump in with me to Nehemiah chapter 10. As you're turning there or you're finding it on your device, we're going to obviously put parts of the text up on the screen, but as you're doing that, let me just remind you that the people have confessed their failures, they've repented, and they have pledged to God. They've signed an oath, and that's where chapter 10 begins. There's a whole bunch of names of signatories. That's what that whole list is for the first half of chapter 10, the people who are signing, saying, we are a part of this group of people who are making a vow. But then in the middle of chapter 10, we start to get an outline of what the vow is. So in verse 28, it says this, then the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all who had separated themselves from the pagan people of the land in order to obey the law of God, together with their wives, sons, and daughters, and all who were old enough to understand, they joined their leaders and bound themselves with an oath. They swore a curse on themselves if they failed to obey the law of God as issued by his servant Moses. They solemnly promised to carefully follow all of the commands, regulations, and decrees of the Lord, our Lord. So what happens here is they begin to outline the vow that they're making, and they begin with a reordering, or they begin the reordering with a first step. And it's this, that they are setting a reordered life which begins with a commitment to follow God's way. We will go God's way. I want you to notice a phrase there in verse 28 that can't be missed. All of these people who had separated themselves from the pagan people of the land in order to obey the law of God. What the text is reminding us of is that these people have decided that we are different, we're unique, we are set apart, which is the actual definition of that word sanctify, to set apart, that we are set apart as God's people, and they have coalesced into this group, into this place, in order to faithfully obey all of the law that God has given them. That's an ambitious endeavor that they've undertaken, but this has been the journey they've been on. I think it's fascinating to watch the Old Testament history as it plays out over all of those years leading up to Jesus, that there's a pattern that shows up with God's people, that God gives them the law, he gives them the direction, it's very specific, and they are very driven to experience this life that God has promised them, this meaningful, rich life. And so what they do is they say, yes, we will go your way, we will follow your way, we will obey your law. But then over time, what happens is their commitment to obey wanes. And little by little, they abandon that following of God's way, and they begin to follow their own way. And then what happens is the consequence of them following their own way is destruction and disillusionment and despair, all of the things that we find happening right now in this story, or we found happening in the beginning of this story, the fall and collapse of their city, their order, their life occurs, and they become to this place where they go, oh, this is a mess, and we need to be reordered. And God says, here's the deal. You can get out of the punishment of choosing to go your own way if you choose to go my way. And then they renew that commitment. And it's just a pattern as you read it through the Old Testament. And I find myself often reading through the stories of the Old Testament, watching the people go through this pattern and thinking to myself, these people are so primitive and they're so uneducated. Why do they keep doing this? They just kind of choose to follow God, and then they stop following quite as closely, and then God warns them and they experience the punishment and the pain of not following God. And I find myself going, oh, that guy's in the mirror. Because that happens for me. And it happens for you too. See, this isn't just a story about a moment in time. This is a story about the tendency of humankind. It's a story about who we are. That here's God's invitation to experience the rich and abundant and wonderful life if we will go his way. If we will set ourselves apart as holy for him, and that we will choose to follow God's way. Let me make a statement that's going to sound logical, and you're going to go, okay, you spent time studying to say this? I did. You can't go God's way if you choose to go your way. Because if you're going your way, and you're asking God to follow you. See what I'm saying there? And it seems like, isn't that a ridiculously logical and meaningless statement in the middle of this message? We all know this, except we all know it, but there's a difference in knowing and doing. Because our tendency is to invite God along for the journey rather than go where God takes us. Here's where a reordered life begins. We're going to go your way. We're going to follow every command, every regulation, every rule. We're going to go your way. We're going to be faithful to that law that you have given us. You are God, we are not, and we will go your way. That broad statement then gets broken down into some more specific statements over the next few verses. So look back down with me. We see the next part of a reordered life. I'm going to go ahead and tell you what it is. It starts with a commitment to follow God's way, but the next part of a reordered life is a life that is exclusively God. This is a statement about exclusivity, and here's the way they say it. Verse 30, we promise not to let our daughters marry the pagan people of the land and not to let our sons marry their daughters. Now, some of you are feeling for me in this moment going, okay, in addition to the names, this is a really weird moment for you, Lee. What are you going to do with this? And there's a whole lot of things I could do with it. There's a lot of sermons right there in that one verse. I just want to focus on one simple thing. God says, look, you should be exclusively mine. That's the principle behind this, because here's what's happening. They've set themselves apart from these pagan peoples. You saw that back in verse 28. That's why I pointed it out to you. Their existence and their practice of life is to be separated so that they can be obedient to the law of God, so they can follow all the rules, regulations, and commands that he's given them, that they could live out what it looks like to be followers of Jesus. But here's what happens. They move into the land, and as they move into the land, they meet their neighbors. And as they meet their neighbors have a different way of going. And their neighbors have a different kind of rhythm to their life, and there are parts of their neighbor's life that they look at and they say, oh, wow, that's kind of attractive, and I kind of like that. And what they start doing is they start marrying into those neighbor ideas. And what happens is in marrying into those neighbor ideas, those neighbors are bringing into their homes pagan worship and pagan gods. And they're trying to blend them all together. They're trying to make them all peacefully cohabitate. They're trying to make it all work. Ezra was terribly concerned about this. If you know a little bit about the context of the Old Testament, you know that there's the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. They live next to each other. Ezra is a major player in the book of Nehemiah. In fact, some scholars say he contributed at least at some part or some portion of the writing of the book of Nehemiah as he tells Nehemiah's story. Ezra writes a book, and in his book, he's pointing out that the temple is in disrepair. It's a different time period, different project, but he talks about the temple being in disrepair and is calling the people to rebuild the temple. And then as Nehemiah comes along and begins to rebuild the city, Ezra has been saying a part of the problem has been you've allowed this blending to occur. Ezra chapter 9 is one of those lengthy moments that Ezra writes about how the intermarrying has brought in these pagan ideas and these pagan practices. And what fundamentally God is teaching us here is that a blended relationship with God is no relationship with God. That you can't have a blended relationship. God would state it in a variety of ways. In Isaiah, he would say to his people, I will give glory to none other. Like, I'm the only one. Not like I'm one of a few or I ought to get the most. Like if you've got 100 beads, I need to get 55 and everybody else gets the other 45 divided. No, he said, if you've got 100 beads, they're all mine. You're exclusively mine. In fact, we know the big 10 that God gave back in Exodus to his people, and it leads with this: you shall have no other gods, and some translations say before me, and other translations say beside me. Not I'm one of your gods, I'm the one that sits at the top of the pyramid. No, I am the only God. So here's the problem. We live in a world of syncretism. That's a big word. That's one of those words that you say, hey, can you use that in a sentence? We live in a world of syncretism. Syncretism is just this. It's the amalgamation or the attempted amalgamation of religions and cultures and ideologies to try to peacefully cohabitate. I think you understand where I'm going with all this, right? I think you see it all around you, right? You start to bring in a little bit of what's here and what's there, and you start to modify so that everything is copacetic, right? And that's what the people are doing. That's why they're having to reorder their life. They're having to reframe this. God said, no, a blended relationship with me is not a relationship with me. You can't do that. And there are so many ways I could illustrate this. Do you need? Well, here. Let me just take a minute and illustrate it. Some of you have been looking at my Chick-fil-A bag and going, how'd you get that on a Sunday? I didn't. I was preparing in advance, one of those unusual moments in my life. So here's the thing, a little bit about me. I am a creature of habit. I know how to use this, I know I do. If this breaks, my daughter will kill me. I am a creature of habit. Every day, I start my day with a banana. Now, there's a lot of story behind banana, and there's not a lot of time in this message. Bananas are good, okay? I love bananas, and there's not a day goes by that I don't start with a banana. And then, as I said, sometimes my life gets busy, and I eat lunch on the run. And there's nothing better when you're eating lunch on the run. Some of you are looking at me like I am the Chick-fil-A sandwich right now. That's awesome. There's nothing better than a good Chick-fil-A sandwich. I think you're starting to track me here. Now listen, it wouldn't be a good illustration about food without Brian's favorite, right? For dessert, I need a little Reese's cup, right? Here we go. In fact, I can't eat just one. It's a little like Doritos. So here we go. A couple of these. Now, independently, these are all pretty good. I'm starting to feel a little sick. And when I feel sick, everybody knows vitamin C is a good choice, right? So let's keep the doctor away a little bit here. You guys are dying, right? You're like, why did I come to church today?
I was hungry till he started.
You're like, is he really going to do this? The answer is, yep. Get it nice and blended. Now, when I was in youth ministry, I used to give away great prizes for anybody who would drink that. Is that appetizing? Anybody want to eat that? You can call that a lot of things, but you can't call it a banana. You can't call it a Chick-fil-A sandwich. You can't call it a Reese's cup. You can't even call it breakfast, right? Listen, the whole reason that gross-looking amalgam is up here is because we tend to do this in how we relate to God. This is what God's dealing with. It's me, exclusively me. Only me. When you start adding in all these other stuff, you try to blend in with the cultures that are around you. And for some of you, you need me to do this so you can hear the rest of the message. Is that good? Is that out of the way? The line of sight there? You all good with that? He says, that's what you get. In fact, just for a moment, I mean, there's a very poignant moment right here because some of you are feeling a little sick at your stomach watching this. That is your body's metaphor for what it looks like when we are not exclusively His. That's a moment, right? And what God says is the reordered life is a life that's exclusively mine. And God invites all of us into this amazing, better than life. And He is inclusive. I want to be really clear about this. This is the most inclusive invitation I know of in the history of the world. But let's be clear, God's inclusive invitation is not a permissive invitation. We have equated that. We've equated inclusivity with acceptability. But what God says is, you are all invited to be included in my way. However, you must choose to go my way, exclusively my way. The reordered life is a life that is exclusively God's. Then as you make your way down through the vow, you see another component. And that's this, that when we experience a reordered life, we experience a sanctified life, our life is a life that is focused on God. Verse 31 says this, when the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or on any holy day. Every seventh year, we will forego the working land and will cancel all debts. They're reinforcing, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. There's that second command that is so familiar. First, you'll have no other gods before me. And then you've come to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. And it's easy for us, if we're not careful, to think that what God is saying by the Sabbath is, hey, you've worked hard. Now be sure you set aside a day to get a nap in. Be sure you set aside a day to do nothing. But actually, God says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. I've said this, I know before, but I'll say it again. The only way something is holy is if the holy God is involved. It's God that makes things holy. And so what God is leading his people to do is say, we want to experience that vitality of life that has been missing, and we're going to reorder our life and choose to go your way. We're going to choose to be exclusively yours, and we're going to choose to be focused on you, because our life should be focused on you. And when our life is in focus, there is rest. That's why Jesus in the New Testament would say, come unto me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. It's not I will give you a nap, although sometimes that's what he does give us, but that's not the point of what he's saying. What he's saying is when your life is in focus, when it's all in alignment and it's all clear and it's all in focus, there is rest, there's rejuvenation, there's vitality, there's strength. And a focused life is a life that keeps its focus on God, that is focused squarely on God. I have a hobby that I've picked up over the past several years that I take pictures. And I've learned about photography. I'm not sure if I would say a lot, but I'm learning things about photography. And we know in photography that there are three components of a good picture, or taking a good picture. There's shutter speed, there's aperture, which is how wide or small the lens opens, and there's sensitivity, ISO. And we call it the triangle of a good picture. And sometimes I'm looking at something and I'm going to take a picture of it, and I check all of those different pieces and I make the adjustments appropriately as I want to make them. But there's a missing component. It still doesn't look right, because here's the deal. In the middle of all of that, there is focus. I have to stop and I have to turn that focus ring, and I have to get it as sharply in focus as I possibly can. And depending upon my aperture and my shutter speed and my sensitivity, sometimes that focus, if I have the slightest movement, needs to be adjusted again. Sometimes that focus, because I'm focusing on the near field and I want to now focus on the far field, my aperture has a different setting for that, and I've got to readjust the focus. And what God gives us in the Sabbath is he says, on a rhythm of every seventh, stop and adjust the focus so that your life stays in focus on me. Here's what's interesting. They talk about here in their pledge that, we're going to remember the Sabbath by not buying and selling grain, but they also say something about the seventh year, because there was a seventh year Sabbath where they said, we're going to let the land rest. We won't farm for an entire year. History tells us, extra biblical history tells us that on every 7-year cycle, the outside governments would look at the Jewish people and they would say, they're just downright lazy because they're not working all year long. But in fact, they were saying, as God has directed, we're going to let the land rest. And there is some theory, some suspicion that perhaps the rebuilding of the wall actually occurred in that seventh Sabbath year. That the people were in there refocusing on God, and it rebuilt the walls, it rebuilt the city, it rebuilt the temple, it rebuilt life and vitality in the community that they were targeting there in Jerusalem. But it also clearly rebuilt life and vitality in their souls, because God refocused them on him. And then as you move through that vow, there's another part of the reordering life. Commit to go God's way, be exclusively God's, be focused on God. And then a reordered life gives the first and the best to God. So look back down with me, verse 32. In addition, we promise to obey the command to pay the annual temple tax of 1/8 of an ounce of silver for the care of the temple of our God. This will provide for the bread of the presence, for the regular grain offerings and burnt offerings, for the offerings on the Sabbaths, the new moon celebrations, and the annual festivals, for the holy offerings and for the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel. It will provide for everything necessary for the work of the temple of our God. We have cast sacred lots to determine when, at regular times each year, the families of the priests, Levites, and common people should bring wood to God's temple to be burned on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. We promise to bring the first part of every harvest to the Lord's temple year after year, whether it be a crop from the soil or from our fruit trees. We agree to give God our oldest sons and the firstborn of all our herds and flocks, as described in the law. We will present them to the priests who minister in the temple of God. We will store the produce in storerooms of the temple of our God. We will bring the best of our flour and other grain offerings, the best of our fruit, the best of our new wine and olive oil. And we promise to bring to the Levites a tenth of everything our land produces, for it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all our rural towns. A priest, a descendant of Aaron, will be with the Levites as they receive these tithes, and a tenth of all that is collected as tithes will be delivered by the Levites to the temple of our God and placed in storerooms. The people and Levites must bring these offerings of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms and place them in the sacred containers near the ministering priests, the gatekeepers, and the singers. We promise together not to neglect the temple of our God. That's an important declaration, because what it says is, God, you have the first and the best of what I have. And those are important thought processes. I know it was a major shift for me in my thought process when I was stewarding my life, to think that God gets the first, not the last cut. And so often what we offer God in our time, in our talent, in our energy, in our passion, in our finances is, God, I'll give you what's left over when I'm done paying the bills, when I'm done doing my duties, when I'm done, whatever's left over, I'll give you. We've invited God into our lives as this great guest for dinner, and we're serving him leftovers. And the people have to say, if we're a people sanctified, set apart for him, we need to give him the first. So when I sit down, this is just a personal story I learned years ago with my finances. When I sit down every time we pay bills, the first thing I do is give God. And then everything gets built after that. I think about that in regards to how I spend my volunteer time, how I spend my passion, how I spend my energy. The first is God's. You get the first. You get the first cut because you are worthy of it. Listen to me. They don't make this promise because God demanded it. They made this promise because God deserved it. That he is worthy of that. We've sung of his greatness and his goodness this morning. We will celebrate the joy, the peace, the love, and all of the other things that come when God enters our world. And because of all of that, he deserves our first. He deserves it. And a reordered life says, I've been set apart for you, and if I'm set apart for you, the first of what I have is yours. And then they go further and they say, not only will we give you the first, but we'll give you the best. Now, what they knew was that often the first was considered the best. The first sheep to be born or lamb to be born was considered the best. The first fruit was considered the best. The first of the olives and the first cut of the olive oil, if you understand how olive is compressed, the first cut is the best. They said, God, not only are we going to give you our first, but we're going to give you the best of what we have, our firstborn, our first harvest, our first everything. We're going to give you the best, not the leftovers. There's so many stories throughout the course of my life that I could tell, and time won't allow me to do that. But it is so tempting, isn't it, for us to give God what's left and what we can afford. What I have energy and time for, what I have capacity for, God, you can have that. Instead of saying this, all to Jesus I surrender. All to him I freely give. All my thoughts and words and being, all to him. See, that's what a reordered life looks like. It's a life that says first and best are yours. There's one more part of a reordered life as I wrap this up this morning. It's this, that a reordered life is a life that is lived under divine appointment. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time to go into this morning, but I want to make sure you do hear this because I don't want to leave it laying on the table. When you turn the corner to chapter 11 of Nehemiah, you find there that the people are now beginning to live out this reordered life. In chapter 11, verses 1 and 2 say this, the leaders of the people were living in Jerusalem, the holy city. A tenth of the people from the other towns of Judah and Benjamin were chosen by sacred lots to live there too. Pay attention to that. They were chosen by sacred lots to live there too. Judah and Benjamin being outside the city, the rest of Israel. And while the rest stayed where they were, the people committed everyone who volunteered to resettle in Jerusalem. See, Jerusalem, a part of what had happened was it had been vacated. And they knew that in order to restore life and vitality into Jerusalem, not only did they need to build the walls, but they need to re-inhabit the city. So they said, who's going to live here? And there were some people who said, we're already here, we'll stay. There were other people who say, we've worked so hard on this, we want to go and live here. And then there were others that when they cast lots, when you read in the Bible the casting of lots, what the Bible's telling us is this is the way of discerning God's divine call and appointment. That they would cast a lot and they would go, the lot says this must be God telling us this. Listen, can I just say this in real simple form? A sanctified life that is set apart for God, a reordered life that is experiencing the richness of life that Jesus promises in John 10:10 is a life that every single moment of every single day is lived with this awareness that this moment I was set apart for such a time as this by the divine sovereign hand of God Almighty. This conversation, this gift, this moment of quiet, this place that I live, this job that I occupy, this car that I drive, all from the sovereign hand of God with a divine appointment on it, because we as his children are divinely appointed in this world to experience the things that he puts around us, hard and easy. For some of us this morning, we need to hear that this place where I am, or this job that I do, or this relationship that I'm in, or you fill in the blank, was divinely appointed by God. And I have something to do here. I have some assignment from the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and I don't know what it is, and I may never know what it is until I stand before his throne and he says, remember that moment? I put you right there for this thing, and we will bow down and worship the God who set us apart. So this morning, I want to tell you a simple truth on the backside of this little story in the middle of a bunch of names. And it's this: the something greater for us is a reordered life. There is joy, immense joy in a reordered life. I want to pray over you this morning. I invite you to bow with me in prayer, and the prayer I want to pray comes from the pen of the Apostle Paul. And he was praying for his friends, and he said that there was joy and there was victory in the reordered life. And so God, this morning, I pray for my friends both sitting here in this room and joining us online, wherever they are, whatever they're facing, whatever your Spirit has said to them in these moments, in the ways that only your Spirit can say these things. I pray, Father, that we would all pause, do an assessment, and if necessary, reorder our life appropriately. That, Father, we would surrender to your way and we would commit to follow your way. That we would make ourselves exclusively yours. We would focus our lives on you, giving you the first and the best. And you would give us an unusual awareness of the divine appointment that you place on each one of us. So this morning, over every person in the hearing of my voice, I pray that they will say yes to the Holy Spirit, and that according to your word in Thessalonians, Father, they would experience this, that the God of peace would sanctify them, making them holy in every way. May your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless until our Lord Jesus Christ comes again. God will make this happen, because he who calls you is faithful. In the name of Jesus, I pray.